Hello, beautiful community. We're talking Tucker and Putin. And there are two really important issues this raises. And the second one is the most important one, and it's the one you would have thought about already. And we'll come to that second. And that is, how do you, if you're an American citizen, or if you're not, if you're a French or a British citizen, you can think of equivalent issues like this. And you can find yourself in equivalent situations to an American voter who's trying to balance this vis-a-vis Tucker in Moscow. But the conflict here is, this is going to be a Kremlin disinformation operation, but it's also a product of local culture wars, right? Tucker is a product of local culture wars. So we're in the realm of a local phenomenon in American politics, which it would be wrong to attribute to foreign malign forces of interference, because that way you'll say that something local is foreign produced, which it isn't. On the one hand. But on the other hand, this is a Russian disinformation operation. So how do you balance these two things? And we'll come to that, not because it's intellectually fascinating to balance them, but because consistently failing to balance it correctly is going to lose you your democracy over the course of 10, 20 years. And we'll come to that. But the first issue that you would have thought about a bit less, that's fascinating, is the unbelievable deferential tone of Russian propaganda toward Tucker. It's not just euphoric, the tone of the Russian propaganda, it's deferential. Tucker ate his toast, but then he had a second portion. And here he is having the second portion. And in between these two, he looked out of the window. I wonder what he could have thought then. A bit earlier, we saw him in the theatre, and that's where he sat. What would have been his perspective down onto the stage from up there on the balcony? What kind of experience did he have? I mean, this is weird, because surely you guys, beneficiaries of the Putin regime, are supposed to be anti-American, but you're getting on your knees here before an American, partly because he's an American. That is weird. Or is it? And actually it isn't, because here is what's going on. There's an unbelievable normative dependence that 99.32431% of Russians feel toward the West. I've just exaggerated, obviously, but it's an important point to make. And that normative dependence on the West is ubiquitous. It goes across the spectrum of political viewpoints among Russians. There is the viewpoint that says, we want to be like the West. That's one point of view. And unfortunately, the Russian opposition is sunk in that. There is a video on the main channel that explores the issue of whether the Russian opposition has imperialist tendencies, that actually lands on that point and says the real problem is actually an incapacity to, with a real sense of openness and agency, imagine the Russian political space. And instead of that, right, there's this wheeling out of slogans and cliches about wanting to live in harmony like the civilized world does, wanting to be like the West, wanting to live like people in the civilized world do. Now, first of all, even if you wanted to copy the West, that's a bizarre way of going on about it, because you'd precisely not say, I want to be like the West. I'd say, well, what are the different things different Western countries are doing? And what do I want to borrow, and what do I want to keep out? So even from that point of view, this slogan is an absurd evasion of actual politics and actual reflection. But it's worse than that, because there is no guarantee at all that what Russia needs is going to be derived from whatever combination of possibilities you find currently practiced in Western countries, especially as the West is in democratic decline. But the Russian opposition, with many exceptions, right, and the exceptions are wonderful and free people who are not caught up in this prejudice, but the majority of the Russian opposition has this story: we want to live like the civilized West does. A lot of the beneficiaries and supporters of the Putin regime say, and this is the second possibility, we want to do the opposite of the West. So whatever the West is, we want to do the opposite. But then there's a third possibility, which says, and this is also peddled by Russian propaganda, so not just we want to be the opposite of the West, but this third position, which says we do want to be like the West, but the West has forgotten what it truly is. And as soon as it remembers that and gets rid of all the things the Kremlin wants us to get rid of, then the West will, as it were, remember its true identity, its true character, and then the Russians will be able to say that they want to be like that West. And if the West is like that West, then they'll be able to say we want to be like the West again. And it's this third bucket into which Russian propagandists put Tucker Carlson. He is the West, and the Russians still, the beneficiaries of the regime, supporters of the regime, still want to be like the West in that sense. But they want to be like the West that has forgotten what it really is about, and it will remember what it's really about when it elects Trump, Le Pen, and on the list might go. So, stunning normative dependence on the West that is just ubiquitous, and that's what's up with all of this. Tucker is eating his second toast, and we wonder what he's feeling. So, I mean, there is almost a colonial quality to this, right? Well, the colonizers are here, and we want to, in fact, learn civilized values from them. Right? That's really it's the position of a submitting colonized party. That's the response to Tucker. Okay, let's get to ourselves now. How do we balance this thing? Because it's really easy for us to become childish. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you felt like this and say, Tucker and everybody who likes him is a Russian asset. Well, in a trivial sense, that might be true. In the sense that they're serving a Russian interest with this particular action. But if by Russian asset you mean what you really should mean by it, and that's to say that a Russian asset in the United States, a US citizen who is a Russian asset, is an agent whose Rada, if you like, is operated from outside. Right? Well, Tucker's Rada is not operated from outside. It is indigenous. Right? What Tucker does is algorithmically ride moments of moment in US culture wars. That's what decides what Tucker is and what Tucker does. So in that sense, he's not a Russian asset. But it's tempting to say Russian asset and just close the conversation. But then you create a lot of democratic danger for yourself. And that's what we've got to explore. And there are three very simple principles here. One is, do not conflate local, indigenous produced political moments of moment with artificially constructed occurrences triggered by malign foreign interference, right? So that means I can sit here as somebody who in Britain voted Remain in the Brexit referendum and say, well, yeah, the Russians rather like this idea of Brexit and they try to do the little bit here and a little bit there to make a difference. But I lost the Brexit referendum for reasons that are overwhelmingly and almost exhaustively domestic. So that's the first principle, right? I can't start going around calling Brexiteers Russian assets. Because what I'll be doing is effectively calling my political opponents, and notice political opposition is the relation of cooperation, like playing a game of tennis. I want to beat you, but I want to beat you within shared rules. I want to beat you on the head with a tennis racket. So I am designating fellow citizens as enemies. And that's extremely dangerous because you should be really slow to do that, especially in a world in which they are designating you as an enemy. Large groups of citizens mutually designating each other as enemies is only something that democratic institutions can sustain without snapping for a decade or two. Then they'll snap. So we've got to be extremely careful about this. First principle. Second principle, we're not careful about this to the point of downplaying or denying facts about Russian interference. So we've got to be objective about how the Russians are interested in destabilizing our democracies and how they're taking positive action to do that. We've got to understand how the Russians are doing it and why they're doing it without illusion too. We shouldn't project onto the Russians aspirations they don't have. We've got to get their aspirations right. And we've got to get the efficacy of their interventions right. We don't want to start with the reality of a particular Russian intervention having an efficacy of 0.1% and treat it as though it had a 30% efficacy in a particular outcome in Western domestic politics. So the second principle, don't for goodness sake underestimate Russian interference or factually misrepresent it. Just don't exaggerate it. And don't be the depoliticized citizen who wants to avoid reality, which is what the depoliticized blob in the middle in Russia do. Don't be like that by pretending that you don't need to deal with your fellow citizens who you're in a conflict with, by excusing yourself with the fantasy that they're produced by malign foreign interference. Right? If you want somebody who balances these two things really well and is an expert on interference and Russian interference, look up Thomas Rid, R-I-D. He's wonderful in balancing sort of soberness and expertise here. And the third principle here is that getting the first two principles right is not just an intellectual pleasure, it's an essential democratic demand. You get these things off balance for a long enough time, you're going to imperil your democracy. So that's really important. And that means we've got to watch for self-congratulatory tendencies in ourselves, right? Childish tendencies in ourselves to designate our local political opponents as foreign-generated enemies. It's a very natural tendency in the algorithmic bubble that you're in, and it's extremely dangerous. So be very careful about it. Now, last separate remark on the issue of what the interview will look like. The interview will not be journalistic. It'll be Tucker giving Putin a platform without really challenging him. And what Putin will try to do is appear fluffy to a US demographic that is losing trust in institutions, and in particular is losing trust in the US policy of supporting Ukraine. And that is significant because Putin is relying on Western decline as a central part of his strategy for success. And a key pivot in Putin's story about Western decline is that Trump wins in 2024. Now, Putin got burned by Trump in the past, he feels, because Trump got co-opted after winning in 2016, and his Russian policy was not particularly soft. So Putin knows it could work out against him, but he does recognize that Trump is an unpredictable force, and in that sense, he overwhelmingly prefers a Trump victory in 2024. So take that in the context of the balance I've recommended between the local moment in politics and culture wars, and then balancing that against genuine recognition, attribution, interpretation of malign foreign interference. The 26-minute long video on the issue of Russia's breakup is in its very final stages. And I look forward to sharing it. And lots of love. Thanks for your patience with my rant today.